So the message this morning is entitled If with a question mark. So depending upon the kind of emphasis you want to put on the message, it could be if, or if, or if, or it could just be flat out if. But I think in the context of the things that we'll be studying and talking about today, I think you'll be able to draw your own conclusion as to the emphasis on the word. Because the message this morning is taken from the book of Mark, chapter 9, verses 21 through 24. How long has this been happening? Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, since he was a little boy. The Spirit often throws him into the fire or into water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can. Oh, what do you mean, if I can? Jesus asked. Anything is possible if a person believes. The father instantly cried out, I do believe, but just help me overcome my unbelief. So imagine that you had this really killer Christian ministry going on. Imagine that you're healing hospitals full of sick people. Imagine that you're casting out demons left and right every day, and then one day, a dad brings his son to you, and right there in front of your very eyes, the boy has a seizure. So you do what you've always done. You whip off your jacket. You expose this big S on your chest, and you say what you've been saying, and you pray like you've been praying, and nothing. So you kind of clear your throat and say what you've been saying, but you say it just a little bit louder. And you pray what you've been praying, but you pray just a little bit harder, and crickets. The boy is convulsing. The dad has this deer caught in a headlight kind of look. And you? Well, you just got kryptonited. So what do you do? What do you do in a situation like that? Do you just figure that the boy must have had some sort of unconfessed sin in his life, and that's what's causing this disconnect? If so, that'd be like saying that the power of God stops because of this particular disconnect, and you know that that's not true. Because if it were true, then nobody could be saved. Or do you declare that the boy has been healed even though he's still convulsing on the ground? Well, you try that, and the father would think that you were nuts. So how about just simply being puzzled? That would probably be a very honest reaction, and it was exactly the reaction of the disciples when they were confronted with this same situation. But the story is a little on the mysterious side because a lot of us, I think, would like to know just a little bit more about the circumstances. For instance, where's the mother in the story? Or was he a single dad? And how about the child? How old is he? Is he a toddler? Is he a teenager? Is he a young adult? And where's the medical records? And where's his chart? I mean, is there like a doctor in the house? Have we nothing to go on in terms of a possible diagnosis? Maybe we should just call a house, because he solves all those medical dilemmas in the space of an hour on a TV show, right? There's just so little information about this incident that we tend to kind of make stuff up to fill in the gaps of our imagination with a story like this. But when you think about it, the story is really pretty simple. A man brings his demon-possessed son to Jesus' disciples to be healed. They can't, so the boy is brought to Jesus while a crowd gathers, at which time the boy convulses and the crowd collectively gasps. And when asked, the dad tells Jesus that this has been going on for a really long time, and that the boy's been close to being either burned alive or drowned more times than the father can remember. And then he says to Jesus, "Have mercy on us and help us if you can." And I don't know, you know me, I sometimes take some poetic license with the scripture and try and intuit what was going on. But here's a father who is desperate to have his son healed and suggests to Jesus to have mercy and heal his son if he can. Now, I don't know what Jesus did exactly in response to that. I'm assuming that because he was Middle Eastern, he probably had kind of olive brown eyes. And he's probably looking at the dad. And maybe there was this long hesitation between the father's suggestion that maybe Jesus could do something and Jesus' response. And the dad is probably thinking, uh-oh, this can't be good. Because Jesus' response is, what do you mean if? Kimosabi. Remember Roy Rogers? Tonto? There are at least 2 points, I think, to be noticed in this particular story, church. The first is that Jesus was helping the dad to understand that the issue was not with Jesus' power. The issue was with the man's faith. Obviously, the man had some faith in Jesus, or he wouldn't have bothered to bring the boy to Jesus in the first place. Or maybe he was just desperate, willing to try anything. But for whatever reason, his trust in Jesus wasn't at the level that it needed to be. He still had some doubts in his mind. Maybe he was growing in his faith, but the fact is, he was still struggling. Have any of you ever been there? Growing in your faith, but still struggling sometimes with doubt? But the other point to this story is Jesus' affirmation that anything is possible if a person believes. And sometimes we, I think, take that out of context. And I think it has to be looked at within the context of what Jesus was saying. It has to be read within the context of the circumstances in which the statement was made. Jesus wasn't saying to this man, anyone can do anything if they only believe. That'd be like saying you can spread your arms and fly like an eagle off the Coronado Bay Bridge. Yeah. But regardless of what you believe, you'll drop like a sack of cement, and maybe, just maybe, if you're lucky, you might live to tell about it. So in response to Jesus' challenge, if the father cries out with this sort of agony that I think only a parent can really know, I do believe, Jesus, I really do. But man, just help me with this unbelief. But then when you think about that statement, it's a little strange, don't you think? I mean, it's internally inconsistent. I believe, so help me with my unbelief. But Jesus, rather than condemning the man for a faith that had been overwhelmed by personal doubts, immediately rebukes the unclean spirit and commanded it to leave the boy, never to enter that boy again. In fact, Jesus' exorcism of that spirit was so complete that the boy was left so calm that they actually thought the boy was dead. The spiritual confusion of the father, however, is so typical of the intellectual and emotional turmoil that can plague any one of us at any given moment in time. Let's face it, No one in this church has a red-hot faith that goes 24/7, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year for decades. It just doesn't work that way. For instance, we know there's a God who made us because the evidence is absolutely, without any doubt, and so clear and indisputable that only a fool could deny it. That's what's written in Psalm 14, verse 1, and Paul writing in Romans chapter 1, verses 20 through 23. And intellectually, we know that God cares for us because he gave his son Jesus Christ to die for our sins so that we might live with him eternally. But sometimes we hurt, and we hurt badly. Or maybe we hurt physically. Maybe we hurt emotionally. Maybe we hurt spiritually. And we hurt, and the hurt overpowers our heads. And we start thinking with our heart, not with our intellect. Agony has a way of pushing logic aside, and we begin to think with how we feel. Oh, we still believe. There's no doubt about that. But we're angry because we feel like God has neglected us. We can't understand why God just doesn't rush right into our rescue. So we pout and we refuse to talk to him. And then we think we'll punish God a little bit further by refusing to go to church. And then we may even say harsh things to him. Almost like literally shaking our fist in his face. The truth is that it's at times like these that we need to get a grip. We need to cry out, Lord, help me please overcome this unbelief. We need to ask for his patience. Maybe we need to weep a little bit. Maybe we need to analyze our situation and consider perhaps that maybe we've contributed to our own delinquency in the circumstances in which we find ourselves. But what we absolutely must not do is give in to our frustration. Because once we quit struggling with our faith and then let it slide, we're headed down a very slippery slope that could lead to eternal ruin. A lot of us, I think of faith and unbelief as opposite ends of the same rope. But according to Jesus, it's possible to believe and to doubt all at the same time. Did you know that? Matthew chapter 21, verse 21 says, I tell you the truth, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but you can also say to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea and it will be done. You see, what the Father was saying is that he had faith, but he also had unbelief. And his unbelief had apparently paralyzed his faith. It's kind of like having two teams of horses hooked up to the same wagon, pulling in opposite directions. One team negates the other, and you get absolutely nowhere. Do any of you own Levi's? Have you ever looked at the tag? It's one mule going one direction and one mule going the other direction. I think Levi Strauss was using this as being indicative of the quality of the pants that you were purchasing, that you could have a team of horses tugging at either side and they wouldn't rip. But if we start thinking about faith and unbelief and think that they are on the same continuum, we just wreck our brains. Because we get nowhere if we start thinking that way. So after identifying the problem, which was unbelief, Jesus later assures the disciples that their faith was not the issue. In fact, even if their faith was the size of a mustard seed, it was sufficient to move mountains. So the real obstacle here was their unbelief. Later in Matthew's gospel, Jesus even called them an unbelieving and perverse generation. That's in Matthew chapter 17, verse 17. It's like Jesus was saying, you have faith, but it has been completely undermined by your unbelief. Now, some translations interpret unbelief as the same as little faith. For instance, Jesus' answer in Matthew chapter 17, verse 20, begins, because of your little faith. At least in some translations it says that. But I think personally it makes for a poor translation because it makes it sound as if Jesus is contradicting himself. The Greek word for unbelief, which is apistia, as used in Matthew chapter 17, verse 20, is the identical word used by the boy's father when he says, help me overcome my unbelief. So although some translators equate unbelief with little faith, Jesus, it would appear, is saying that little faith is not the issue. Since a little faith can move a mountain, and if a little faith can move a mountain, it can certainly heal a demon-possessed boy. In other words, it's not the size of your faith that matters so much as whether your faith is handicapped by doubt and unbelief. It's kind of like driving a car with the emergency brake on. Have any of you ever done that? You can move the car, right? It doesn't travel terribly well. You will not get very good gas mileage, and eventually you will burn up your emergency brake. So it can travel, but it doesn't travel as conveniently and as carefree as it ought to be without the emergency brake on. And pure childlike faith, untainted by grown-up unbelief, is what moves mountains. Pure faith is a strong faith. So what kind of unbelief undid the Father and Jesus' disciples? Because I only read you a snippet from Matthew about this account. I would encourage you to go home and finish reading that chapter. Because after Jesus healed the boy, the disciples said, wow, why couldn't we do that? And Jesus then discusses with them why. But I get the impression that I'm not exactly sure, but maybe the disciples were unnerved by the sight of a convulsing child frothing at the mouth. I mean, any seizure is frightening, especially in a child. And it would have been especially terrifying knowing that there was a demon behind the seizure. But unfortunately, natural unbelief is fueled by what we see and by what we hear. And when it comes to medical issues, in particular, I think, our unbelief sends us to Google, to type in WebMD, looking for the reassurance and the hope that we need, even if we have faith. Oh, we may be declaring the promises of God over our situation, but we're also feeding our doubts by heeding our circumstances. So, how do you deal with unbelief? The simple answer to that question, although not necessarily simple in application, is you starve it. Read Mark chapter 9, verse 29, and you'll see what I mean. Because unbelief that arises from ignorance and bad theology can be corrected by showing people the truth. Mark chapter 6, verse 6. But overcoming natural unbelief requires prayer and fasting. Your body needs to learn that it's not in charge. And by fasting, for a time at least, you're telling your five senses that there's more to life than just food. Prayer and fasting doesn't necessarily move God into action. It may. It certainly is not going to move the devil. But fasting and prayer will move you because it affects you. So instead of trying to build a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger faith, maybe we need to stop feeding our unbelief. In other words, we need to fix the right problem. You know, when there's a problem in our life, a strategy that Satan sometimes uses is to divert our attention into fixing the thing that's not broken. That way, we're doubly messed up. We've fixed the part that's not broken and not fixed the part that needs fixing. I mean, assuming that we can fix anything without God's help. But if Christ is living in you, there's nothing wrong with your faith. You might have a problem with unbelief, but your faith is not the issue. It's unbelief that limits the power of God in your life, not a small faith. And today there's a lot of emphasis on faith and getting more faith. So like the disciples, sometimes we pray, Lord, increase my faith. That's what they said in Luke chapter 17, verse 5. But Jesus' response to that request was, your faith is not the problem. Even a little faith will get the job done. Now that's kind of a paraphrase of mine, but that's Luke chapter 17, verse 6. He tells the disciples, look, your faith is not the issue here. It's your unbelief. And the reason why our faith is not the problem is because it's not our faith. It's his faith. Paul said that he was justified by the faith of Jesus Christ and lived by the faith of the Son of God. Galatians chapter 2, verses 16 and 20. He understood that faith was a gift from God. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. And that's why when Peter healed a crippled man outside of the temple, much to the crowd's astonishment that Peter could do something like that, he gave all the credit to a faith that had come from God. And if you don't believe me, that's Acts chapter 3, verse 16. Unfortunately, too many times we think there's something wrong with our faith, but that's like saying God gives defective gifts, and you know he doesn't. So stop worrying so much about your faith, because if you're a believer, as you are, you already have enough faith to move your mountains. Maybe it's not faith that's the problem. Maybe it's unbelief. And maybe unbelief is the problem. And if so, then perhaps a little prayer and a little fasting may be just what the great physician, the doctor, Jesus, ordered. And then I would encourage you to schedule a follow-up appointment with the doctor to see him the next week. So church, this week, don't question your faith. If you have questions in your mind about your faith, you have enough faith. Otherwise, you wouldn't be questioning your faith. But instead of it being a lack of faith, maybe it's this unbelief that this dad was articulating, that I've got faith in you, Jesus, but just help me overcome that part of me, that doubt that I just struggle with. And maybe that should be our prayer too, that it's not a lack of faith, but perhaps it's unbelief that paralyzes a faith, that absent the unbelief would allow us to have wings like eagles and soar like the prophet Isaiah was talking about. So my encouragement to you this week, you're good with your faith, church. Work on that unbelief part. Maybe that's what's crippling and handicapping what you believe to be a little faith. It's not. It's those struggles that we deal with that sometimes hinder us from having a deeper and a more abiding faith that all of us obviously are looking for. So I told you I was going to give you a 6-hour sermon so that we could make the song applicable, because the song is called Why Not Tonight? But it's 10 till 12. I might even let you out of here before noon, and that would be a miracle. It is night somewhere. Very good. It's night somewhere. So just pretend it's night. And when the song says, oh, why not tonight? Think of it as if you were in Australia or some other location. There you go. But then it wouldn't rhyme with the rest of the song, I guess, Dee, so that's the issue. But in this particular song, it's encouraging you, like, why not now? Do you need to postpone making decisions about your own spirituality and your own relationship with God for some other time? Kind of like Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. I'll just think about that tomorrow. Remember that scene? This song asks you to make that commitment today, not tomorrow. And if you have any prayer requests, you can hand them up as we sing this song. We'll go over the prayer requests, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and let's sing.